We look at this in terms of how we go about discussing diseases, how we go about discussing health issues within the medical community. And it goes back to what we talked about previously in terms of feedback regulation. And that is, what is dysfunction? What is dysregulation? What does it mean? And what does it have to do with pathophysiology? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So this goes back to the idea of homeostasis, how we go about dealing with homeostasis. When we're looking at homeostasis, we're talking about that fluctuating ability to maintain a proper function. And that proper function is done through appropriate regulation. What we're dealing with when we're dealing with this feedback regulation, we're dealing with this homeostasis, is that we're trying to eliminate the stress. We're trying to eliminate the stress so that we have an appropriate response so that we're able to maintain optimal performance. But sometimes it doesn't always happen, doesn't take place. So what ends up happening is sometimes we get these signals, sometimes we get this disruption, and the disruption causes a hormonal response. That hormonal response leads to a response at the tissues through the hormones binding on the tissue, causing a change in cellular function, which leads to a change in the signaling taking place within the cell, which leads to a change in genetic expression, which leads to a change in the proteins that are being synthesized and cell function. That whole cellular response is going to lead to a return to homeostasis. That return to homeostasis is going to eliminate that stress. And it's done through positive and negative feedback, as well as through feed forward mechanisms. What are we talking about? We're talking about this feedback and feed forward issues. Negative feedback. What we're trying to do is we're trying to keep everything just right. The way in which we talk about this is keeping it baby bear. Where we have this stressor. That stressor leads to an intermediate response. That intermediate response leads to our initial response to the stressor, which is going to slow down the rate of the intermediate steps so that we can slowly start to eliminate the stressor. If we're able to eliminate the stressor, nothing else happens. However, a lot of times it's going to trigger a secondary intermediate step, which is going to trigger a secondary step, which is going to slow down all of the steps that came before it. The whole idea here with negative feedback is we're trying to slow down the rate of responses so that we get the appropriate responses necessary to the stressor all the way through the whole entire cascade of events until we get to the desired response. That desired response is going to eliminate the stressor. It's going to slow down the rate of responses throughout the whole entire cascade so that we do not go too far away from keeping everything just right. We can do the same type of thing in terms of positive feedback, but in positive feedback, what we're going to think about is we think about this kind of like a Three Little Pig episode, where what we're going to do is we're going to go start with our initial response to that stressor. That initial response to the stressor is going to take us from that straw hut to a twig hut. And what's going to do is it's going to say, okay, I need more response because I need to make sure that twig hut is going to be stronger than the straw hut. And so what ends up happening is we get this greater amount of intermediate step. That greater amount of intermediate step leads to a greater level of response that we see in an attempt to eliminate the stressor. But we don't eliminate the stressor and we cause more response to take place. That more response is going to cause even more response. We're building a stronger house. That's going to hopefully eliminate the stressor, but it's going to eliminate the stressor by causing more responses to take place. We're going to continue to have additional responses taking place. That additional responses taking place is going to lead to an excessive amount of desired response. That excessive amount of desired response is going to eliminate the stressor. The whole idea here with positive feedback is we're going to eliminate the stressor as fast as possible without care for the long-term ramifications of our responses. We want to get rid of that stressor. We want to get rid of that stressor so that we're able to get back to homeostasis as fast as possible. That set of responses is going to lead to adaptations. The adaptations is I'm going to make sure I'm able to resist the stressor so that I'm able to survive. When we start looking at this idea about adaptations, it comes down to specific adaptations to impose demands principle, the SAID principle. That is, the tissues and the cells of the body are going to respond in such a way that they're able to resist the specific stresses that are being placed on them based off of the signals that are being imposed on them in an attempt to get back to homeostasis. And it's all based off of the specificity of the stress. What we're going to end up being able to do is we're going to be able to respond to that stress better, which means we have a different level of homeostasis, which means we have a better survivability and a better suitability to the stressors that I'm facing. Now, the problem comes in, this is where we start looking at dysregulation and dysfunction, is that it can lead to a maladaptive response. And that maladaptive response is where we do not get the appropriate homeostatic response, but we get a different response that we're not intended to get. And so what we start doing is we start looking at this response here. And it's the same response we saw before. What we're going to do is we're going to get a return to homeostasis. And the return to homeostasis can lead to secondary signals. And that secondary signals leads to a tissue-specific adaptation. And that tissue-specific adaptation leads to a new homeostatic level, a new homeostasis. Since I now have a new homeostasis, the initial stressor no longer causes a disruption to my homeostasis, nor does the hypothalamus or pituitary trigger any type of cortical signaling to a homeostatic disruption because I now have a new level that I'm supposed to be at. And so what's this look like in terms of normal feedback regulation? In terms of normal feedback regulation, I'm going to make sure that I'm not too high, I'm not too low, everything is always just right. But that doesn't always come into play, especially when I start looking at facing stresses. When I start looking at facing stresses, I'm going to try to get back to being just right, which means that I'm going to go from not too high, not too low to not caring about not too high, not too low, because I have to get rid of the stress, which means all of my responses amp up. All of my responses amping up can come about through positive feedback mechanisms, can come through feed forward mechanisms, can come through learned responses. But this feed forward response, this positive feedback response, if I do not get rid of the stress at the appropriate response time, can lead to issues. This is the type of things that we see when we start looking at responses that we get to exercise in terms of muscle growth, in terms of bone growth, in terms of cardiorespiratory responses, where we get the appropriate responses that we want because we're getting back to just right following exercise. This is the responses that we see in terms of thermoregulation to heat responses where we start to stress. This is when we start to sweat. When we start to sweat in response to the heat stress. But once the heat stress is gone, we stop sweating. But what happens if I can't get back to just right? This is where we start looking at the issues of dysregulation and dysfunction, where instead of being able to go back to normal, I stay at that amped level of response. And that amped level of response causes exhaustion to come into play. And when exhaustion comes into play, I'm going to have tissue breakdown, and tissue breakdown is going to lead to disease issues. And that's where we have to kind of meld together various physiological principles, in particular Solei's gas response in terms of alarm, resistance, exhaustion within our normal pathophysiological responses or within our physiological responses that can lead to pathological responses. And so we start looking at that idea of staying amped up for too long a period of time. This is what I should be looking at. I should be looking at the ability to return to homeostasis through normal regulations. But what happens if I have inappropriate interactions with the tissues or inappropriate receptor binding? If I have inappropriate receptor binding or inappropriate interactions with the tissues where the hormone signals are not the correct hormone signals, or the cell is not responding correctly to the hormone signals, instead of getting normal responses, I now get maladaptations. That maladaptation leads to a dysregulation. That dysregulation leads to a dysfunction. This is stuff that we will see when we start looking at changes in sensitivity of the receptors, something that is a hallmark to a lot of metabolic diseases, where under normal conditions, we have normal equal levels of stress. But when we start looking at this insensitivity issue or this change in sensitivity issue, what ends up happening is that the cell stresses are not matching the body stresses. And because the cell stresses are not matching the body stresses, what ends up happening is that we get an inappropriate response to the hormonal signaling come into play, which leads to an inappropriate response to the changes in cell function. That inappropriate response to change in cell function leads to a differential response, which leads to an overload stress at the cells, which causes the cells to stop responding to the hormones. This is where we get insensitivity to hormones like leptin, insensitivity to hormones like insulin, insensitivity to other types of hormones that come into play, particularly with metabolic issues. that we want to treat with a lot of medicines and with a lot of lifestyle changes. And so that's what happens if we happen to have issues at the receptor site. But that's only one type of issue. Now, the other type of issue is going to be a dysregulation issue. And that dysregulation issue, which leads to the dysfunction, is not coming at the receptor side, but is coming with the change in genetic expression and the change in proteins leading to the dysfunction and the dysregulation. These are the types of things that we see in terms of responses at peripheral tissues that might lead to issues like osteoporosis in terms of a disease issue, that might lead to atherosclerosis in terms of a cardiovascular issue, that might lead to changes in protein arrangements around neurons that might lead to dementia issues. All those issues come about due to a dysfunctional response within the protein nature of the responses within the cell in terms of that whole cascade of events. All of these things do is that it allows us to understand why certain types of diseases come into play, why illnesses can come about, why distinct medicines will work the way in which distinct medicines will work, why we're able to measure distinct biomarkers in terms of distinct types of pathophysiological responses, all due to dysfunction and dysregulation within the systems. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Please make sure you check out more on the podcast as well as within the series of stuff on pathophysiology. Keep watching for upcoming videos on different types of diseases and different mechanisms by which diseases come about. Please make sure to follow us here on YouTube as well as with the podcast. Check out the written stuff in Substack as well as the quick takes we have on Instagram and on Threads.